despite it being 30 degrees out, it's spring. So wearing short sleeves, spring makeup, and we're gonna do a March wrap up. So these are all of the books I read in March. It was a mixed bag this month. So let's just get into it. And of course, my first category is books that I reread, and we'll start with Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. As you can see, I have marked this book up like crazy. I've highlighted passages in here that really spoke to me, and I'm really happy to finally have a physical copy of Get a Life, Chloe Brown, because this has become such a quick favorite for me, and it means so much to me. As a person with fibromyalgia, reading about another character who also has fibromyalgia. So there's this book. This is the fourth time I've read this book. So that is book number 1 that I reread. And then for sleepy time, I have been listening to Sabriel and Lyriel, both by Garth Nix. These are a young adult fantasy series that I absolutely love, and I have read dozens and dozens and dozens of times. The narrator is Tim Curry, who is absolutely phenomenal, and I love these both books to death. And the last book that I reread was The House in the Cerulean Sea. Video review linked above. I absolutely love this book, and there was a period of time in March when I was going through a rough kind of flare-up, and just a couple days there that were just really bad for me. And when that happens, I just love to throw on an audiobook I've listened to before, and I literally lie in bed in the dark with a comforting read on, and House in the Cerulean Sea has become one of those comfort reads for me, and I just absolutely love this book. And if you want to hear my in-depth thoughts on this one, I have a whole 20-minute video talking about how awesome this book is and all of the nitty-gritty details. So these books are all in my favorites, and I highly recommend all of these books. Next genre we're going to get into, I read 1.5 thrillers this month. So we'll just talk about the book that I decided not to finish, and that is The Wife Upstairs by Rachel Hawkins. This was sold to me as a Jane Eyre retelling, but make it a thriller. So I was very excited about this. I didn't love Jane Eyre when I read it for school. I read it in college. I loved Jane as a character in the classic version, but I didn't love a lot of the aspects in the book. So I was really excited to read kind of a modern take on Jane Eyre, and I just didn't like this. I DNF'd it I decided to put it down at like the 30% mark. So nothing really had happened at that point. We were just getting introduced to the characters and the setup of this novel. And the reason I put it down is because the main character was named Jane, but she didn't feel like Jane Eyre. You know what I mean? She felt like she was an interesting character in her own right, but for a Jane Eyre retelling, I wanted the main character to kind of encapsulate the original character a little bit, and she was just completely different. So I was like, not my favorite. There was also this kind of weird aspect, so let me know if this is weird, because it kind of gave me weird vibes. But in the original Jane Eyre, this is spoilers for Jane Eyre if you haven't read it or don't know. So Mrs. Rochester in the original Jane Eyre is half Jamaican. So she is like the only person of color in Jane Eyre. And while that's problematic in its own way, being the locked away mad woman, the only character, who is a POC is the mad woman, that is a whole separate discussion. But in this retelling, the author changed Mrs. Rochester into a white woman, and from the 30% I read, there weren't any other people of color in this book. This was set in kind of like the South USA, and I was like, I don't know how I feel about that. But I was just like, you know what? No, I'm not enjoying myself with this one. I'm just gonna pass it along and move on to a different book. The other book, though, that I read was probably my favorite book I read this month, to be honest. It is called Untamed Shore by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is the third book I've read by the author, and also this is my favorite book by this author that I have read. Now, I put this in the thriller category, but this book truly isn't a thriller. It is a noir crime novel / coming of age story. So we're following our main character, Viridiana, who is living in Baja California as a translator. So she takes tourists around her small town and shows them the sights, and she speaks 4 languages. So she translates for them as well with the locals. And one day, 3 tourists come and are staying in like this private home, and they decide to hire Viridiana as a personal secretary and translator. And weird stuff starts to happen. So I put this in this category just to like kind of prep you guys to understand what this book is really about. But it's really about Viridiana going from a naive teenager, because she's 18, and she's got like grand ideas about the world, and she's really young and naive, and she's got all these grand plans, and she wants to get away from her small town. And it's really about her getting involved and entangled in these 3 tourists' lives and the shady things that they're doing. And it's about her growing up and becoming a woman and becoming a very interesting character by the end of this novel. So this is a very character-driven story. It is pretty short. It's like less than 300 pages, or right at the 300-page mark, and I could not put it down. I thought the vibes were fantastic. The writing is amazing, and I was completely blown away by this noir coming-of-age story. It really crosses a lot of genre boundaries, and I absolutely ate it up. And another thing is the author uses shark imagery a lot, and I just thought that was fantastic, considering like the shady nature of these tourists kind of preying on this naive young girl. I thought it was excellent. This is, I think, my favorite book I read this month, so I'm gonna get myself a copy and recommend it to you in every single one of my videos now. So those are the thrillers that I read. All right, we read 2 romance novels this month as well. So the first one is Shipped by Angie Hockman. And this was okay. This is about a, 2 rival employees at a travel agency. They work for like this big cruise ship line, and they are vying for the same position within their company. And so the company decides to send them on a cruise together to get a lay of the land and come up with some like marketing strategies for that particular cruise to get like more people to come to it. And so they're competing for this like marketing position at their company. And the main characters are Henley and Graham. And I just thought this was okay. For a romance book, it just wasn't my favorite. I'll be honest, there wasn't any steam. It was all fade to black, and I guess I don't like that. I wanted more steaminess. So sue me. And that was just one part of the reason I didn't love this book. It was just okay. I don't really have anything else to say about it. It was cute, but it wasn't like a new favorite romance, so I gave it 3 stars. The next book I gave 5 stars, and it's Act Your Age, Eve Brown. This is book 3 in the Brown Sisters trilogy. The first one being Get a Life, Chloe Brown. The second book being Take a Hint, Danny Brown. And this one is the final book in the series, Act Your Age, Eve Brown. Now, Eve is the youngest sibling, and she's kind of chaotic. She doesn't really have her life together. Everyone is always like expecting the worst from her, and at the beginning of the novel, her parents, who are very wealthy, decide to kick her out of the house and say, okay, Eve, you're 26 years old, you have to get a job and kind of fend for yourself. And Eve is clearly upset by this, so she is on a drive and to kind of clear her head, and she sees a sign for a bed and breakfast that is hiring full-time chefs, and she likes to cook for people, so she decides to apply, even though she doesn't have a resume with her or anything. And at the interview, she meets the other main character, who's named Jacob, and he is very stuffy and by the book and rigid, and he does not like Eve from the get-go. However, they are thrust together into Eve working for him because at the end of the interview, Eve accidentally hits Jacob with her car and breaks his wrist and gives him a concussion, and so Eve decides to stay at the bed and breakfast and help Jacob run the business and also to be a chef. So she's kind of nursing him back to health as well. And this was steamy. This was adorable. And I really related to Eve as a character in a lot of ways. You know, I'm also the youngest of 3, daughters. And so there were a lot of moments where Eve was having an internal conflict. And I was like, same, girl, same. So I just really connected to these characters. Both Jacob and Eve are on the autism spectrum, and I thought those conversations were handled really well. I'm not autistic, but I really appreciated those types of conversations, and I thought it was really well done. And their relationship was just really cute, and I loved it. And I also want to get a copy of this because this is just a fantastic little series of a romance novel. All right, let's go to nonfiction. The first one I'm going to talk about is, I'd say this is a kid's book. It's called Galaxy Girls, 50 Amazing Stories of Women in Space by Libby Jackson. And I gave this 3 stars. I thought this was kind of a fun introduction to women in STEM, and specifically women in the, space story, and not just in the United States, but all around the world. There was something I did not like. The way that these women were discussed and the POC women throughout this book were discussed was like, oh yeah, they had so much to overcome back in the day. And I'm like, but POC women of today also have challenges and racial hurdles to overcome. So I didn't really like that aspect, and especially if you're going to read this to like young girls or children, that's definitely like a caveat, I would say. If you're like a parent reading this to your child and you want to talk about racism, that is definitely a topic to discuss, where like, yes, they did have a lot of struggles, but also today it is very similar. So I gave this one 3 stars. I thought it was okay. A good place to start for beginners. The next nonfiction I read was Mediocre by Ijeoma Oluo. And this is the author who also wrote So You Want to Talk About Race, which I also read. So I read both of Ijeoma's books this month, and I thought her writing is fantastic. Both of these books kind of tackle 2 different aspects of racism. So Mediocre is kind of a collection of essays about white male supremacy in America and the history of white male supremacy in focusing on different topics. So one of the first chapters is about cowboys and Native Americans, and to football, to the workplace, and how white male supremacy kind of works within those topics. And this was infuriating, obviously, fascinating, and especially her discussion on politics, I thought was fantastic. She was really calling out some of our politicians in this book, not just the Republicans, and I just thought this was great, to the point where I was like, okay, I love this author's writing style. I'm gonna read her other work, which is So You Want to Talk About Race. Now this one is really important and really handy for especially white people who deem themselves allies but have a hard time confronting racist people in conversation, and how to have and this book really breaks it down on how to have a constructive conversation and how to call people out for racism. So I think this is a must read for white people, absolutely. And this is definitely something that I'm going to reread and keep practicing for myself, about how I can do better about navigating those types of conversations and to be a better ally to Black people in America. So this is a must read, absolutely. The last book I'm going to talk about is a little book called This Book is Anti-Racist by Tiffany Jewell. And this is like a workbook about how to identify your own biases and how to work through them, and then also to have conversations about your biases and how to interact with other people. So this is actually like a workbook. It says, hey, get out your notebook and here's your topic, and brainstorm and write on these things. And so again, this is gonna be really helpful for me personally to work through some of my internal biases and to help me identify my own privileges so I can be aware of what I am doing, and to, in my advocacy, be a better advocate. Hi, hiccup. So these 3 books in conjunction, I think, were really good reads for me, and it really helped me learn and practice being a better ally to BIPOC. And yeah, I gave these 3 books 5 stars. I think they're fantastic. If I were to recommend one, I think So You Want to Talk About Race is probably the one I think is the most important for everyone to read. Last genre category are going to be the sci-fi fantasy books I read this month. The first book I'm going to talk about is Down Comes the Night by Allison Saft. This is a young adult fantasy standalone, actually, and I didn't particularly like this. I gave it 2 stars, and I have a review in my weekend reading blog, so I won't really get into it here, but this was just a miss for me. The next book I'm going to discuss is The Sound of Stars by Alicia Dow. This is a young adult sci-fi standalone where 2 years before the start of the novel, an alien race had come to Earth and is taking over everybody, and basically the aliens have outlawed all forms of media, so art, literature, movies, music, in an attempt to keep the human populace down. So we're following our main character Ellie, who runs an illegal library. She has about 50 books in her collection that she loans out to people who need a respite from the alien invasion and kind of an escape from their reality. And the other perspective is an alien named Morris. Now, Morris is a lab-created alien. So the alien race is called the Allori. And so lab-created Allori are treated as second-class citizens. They're not given the same rights. And so Morris is kind of afraid for his life because he needs to be useful in order for his position in society to remain and to be viewed as a valid person, basically. And so, but Morris is holding a secret. He actually loves human music. So he and Ellie end up meeting, and through a chain of events, they end up running away together and going on this cross-country road trip, trying to find kind of a safe haven for the two of them. And this does have a romance in it, obviously. This is YA after all. So I ended up giving this book 3 stars. I really liked Ellie as a character, but I just didn't particularly like Morris, and I didn't like his voice that much, nor the romance between them. I just was like, I don't really like Morris, so them getting together is kind of okay to me. This has like a Deus Ex Machina kind of ending, which is not my favorite. And I actually with the execution of this novel, I had a hard time visualizing some of the transitions. So this was just okay. It was a 3-star read for me. Oof, final 2. The next book. I finally read The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is the story of Rin, who is a poor peasant girl who tests into the most prestigious military academy in her nation, and she's ostracized for being a peasant, basically. Now, this is a great character book. However, this fantasy world is based off of China, and the war that ensues in this novel is based on the Sino-Japanese War between Japan and China. Now, when I was in school, we covered this war briefly, so I knew some of the atrocities, specifically that the Japanese committed on the Chinese. So in this book, those atrocities are brought up and explored. So this is a really hard book to read at times. The first half of the book, Rin is in the military academy, learning how to be a general, how to be a tactician, and then the second half of the book is she's actually fighting in the war. And also there's magical elements in this book. And towards the end of the book, where the war atrocities start coming in, were really hard to read, and I knew what was going to happen, which is why it took me so long to read this book, because I knew what this would entail violence-wise, and it's brutal. So I highly recommend looking up trigger warnings for this book, content warnings for this book. Look up the Sino-Japanese War between Japan and China to understand the historical context and the inspiration for this book. I think this is dark. This is dark fantasy, I think, at its finest. So while I'm giving all these caveats and warnings, this was super well done. I really liked it as much as you can like something as dark as this with as many like atrocities in it. But I am interested in continuing with the story. I really liked Rin as a character. Yeah, this is really fantastic character work in here, but beware the violence and the atrocities that are discussed and described in depth in this book. So I ended up giving this book 4 stars. My favorite parts of this book were the first half, where Rin was in the military academy, like learning and learning her magic and training to become a warrior and a fighter and a tactician. And then some of the war scenes were a little boring to me, except, you know, those few chapters that were quite grotesque, to be honest. So I ended up giving this 4 stars, and I think I will continue the series, but I really need to be in the mood for something this dark and intense. Last book is Shorefall by Robert Jackson Bennett, and this is book 2 in the Founders trilogy. So book 1 is called Foundryside, and this is a super interesting world. It has some Italian, Venetian influence, but the magic system is called scriving, and scriving basically allows you to tell an object to do something that it's physically impossible for it to do normally. So for example, they've invented automobiles in the society by telling a wheel, hey, wheel, you are going downhill that it has this incline at this speed. And so the wheels think, oh, I'm going downhill, so they actually move on their own. So that is just like a little bit of a taste for how this magic system works. It's really complicated, and it's a lot like computer coding. So you're basically telling an object to do something that it wouldn't normally do, kind of like a computer code. And in the first book, we're following this woman who is a thief, and she steals an object and decides to keep it instead of giving it to the people that she stole it for, and that causes a whole chain of events and a, downhill from there, basically. This series is super duper action-packed. I love how action-packed this is. The stakes are high. I like the humor in this book is kind of childlike, and I kind of like that. So it's got these shifting tones between like this really intense violence and action versus like this lighthearted tone, and so we kind of go back and forth between those two, and I really like this. And so book 2 continues the story with Sansia and her shenanigans. And I love the characters in here. Sansia is gay, and she ends up with a lady at the end of book 1. And I just think this is fantastic. And I need book 3, excuse me. It has no estimated publication date. Rude. Rude. So I gave Shorefall a 4.5 stars. Basically a 5-star, and it was kind of nice to shift from the Poppy War to this book to kind of palette cleanse, if you will. That is it. Those are all the books I read in March. I just want to say thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.